Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord, praise his name, proclaim his salvation day after day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous deeds among all peoples. For great is the Lord, and most worthy of praise. So today's last reading is one of those ones that you guys will get a kick out of. Because when I looked at it when I was getting ready to prepare and looked at the different options that I might have, I said, oh, I don't want to preach on that. So, and you know what happens every time I see one of those ones that I don't want to preach on, then that's the one that you end up having to preach on. So this is a story that probably I have misconstrued for 30 or so years. This is the conversation between Pilate and Jesus. And I've made a fatal flaw all the years that I have looked at this conversation. I have always assumed that this conversation was in public out in front of the palace. But when we get into it, you're going to see this was a private conversation. And being a private conversation, the contextual structure of this conversation changes dramatically. So let's look at the conversation. This is from the 18th chapter of John. This is verses 33 through 37. Jesus has been arrested at the garden. He's been taken to the palace of the high priest, which is Caiaphas was the high priest. It was his father-in-law's house, Ananias, where he was taken. They have tried to do everything they can to get Jesus to admit that he is purporting himself to be a king. And they need to get him to do something against Roman law. Because as Jews, the only thing they can do, and they do have the right to stone him, but they don't want to stone him. They want him crucified. They need this to be a public execution. And the only person who can condemn Jesus to a public execution or a crucifixion is a Roman leader. So it either has to be one of the Herods or Pilate. And because they're in Jerusalem, Pilate is the Roman who is in charge of Jerusalem. So they arrested him probably 7 to 9 o'clock in the evening. They took him to the high priest's palace. He's been there for hours. It's probably now 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning. And they take him to Pilate's palace, which is on the north end of the temple. It's called the Praetorium, and that's where Pilate's palace is, and that's where they are. So Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, meaning he brought him into the palace, And the Jews would not have gone in with him because they would have defiled themselves by going into a Gentile place. So they would not have gone in. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" answered Jesus. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate asked. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Fascinating. Right after this, Pilate tried to set him free. The people wouldn't hear of it. So then Pilate sent him over to Herod, saying, "Oh, well, maybe he's from Galilee. Herod's in charge of Galilee. I'll get Herod to make a ruling over him." Herod would have nothing to do with him. Sent him back to Pilate. Pilate had another conversation with Jesus and came back out and said to the people, "I can find no reason to condemn this man." And the people said, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate's wife sent him a note and said, "Be careful." One more time, he tried to set him free. And he came up with the thing of, "Look, at this time, I always set one free before the Passover. I'll offer you either Jesus or Barabbas." Well, he knew they wouldn't take Barabbas because Barabbas was a heinous criminal. They chose Barabbas because the crowd had been salted to say, "Give us Barabbas, crucify Jesus." So then ultimately, Pilate said, "Crucify him." And we know that whole story. But that's not the end of Pilate's story, nor is that really Pilate's story. I knew I could research Pilate because he truly was a Roman, he was an appointed Roman position, appointed Roman ruler, so there would be a history of him. Pilate remained in his role. Remember, I shared with you a few months ago that when Herod the Great died, they split the country up. They actually say they split it up into fourths, but they really split it up into thirds. And they gave they originally gave, they split the country up into three of his descendants. One of those died, and that's when the Romans said, "We're not giving another Herod descendant any rule. We're going to put our own ruler in." And that's when they appointed Pilate to come and to rule Jerusalem and Caesarea, because they wanted that calm, and the most taxes came out of Jerusalem and Caesarea. Most taxes came out of the Deepwater Port and out of the biggest city. So that's what Rome was interested in, was taxes. So Rome was very concerned about this crucifixion of Jesus, but there were no riots afterwards, and taxes continued to come in. So they left Pilate in charge, and he was there another 6 years. 6 years later, there was a zealot claiming to be a messianic figure up north in the Samaria area. For those of you who went up there, this figure was actually up on one of the mountains outside of Samaria, and he said he was going to dig up some of the Moses relics from there, and he was going to use those to lead the overthrow of Rome. So Pilate dispatched some of his troops and shut this guy and his followers down and killed quite a few of them. Well, out of that came a small riot. That disturbed Rome, and they dispatched Pilate, and Pilate lost his job. And basically went into exile and ended up dying a relatively poor person. Why did Pilate, who was so concerned about not making a fuss over anything, want to go put this messianic zealot down? He knew what he knew. He met Jesus one-on-one. And whether he condemned him to die or not, he knew that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. And also, the guards at the tomb were Pilate's. And when they told him the tomb was empty, Pilate was not surprised. And he knew that Jesus rose, and that did not surprise him. So when he heard the stories of Jesus having risen, that did not surprise him. But when he heard this messianic zealot came, that offended him. And he shut that down. In the Eastern Orthodox churches in northern Africa and a couple of other places, Pilate's actually a saint because of what he did. So that's Pilate's story. A story with a twist that you probably hadn't thought about. We heard David's story. On Tuesday, I stood in the cafeteria at Rosenwald School, and I watched 9 of our family members right here stand and serve meals for an hour and a half with huge smiles plastered across their faces, and made small talk with children and staff, and never once complained about anything, never once. And I thought, gosh, this is a little part of their story. And is what they're doing impacting their story just a little bit? And many of them have talked to me since, and I can tell you it did. But then I also stood there and I watched these 12 to 18-year-old young people who have backstories that not one of us would want to have. Laugh, say thank you, ask very politely for seconds, thirds, fourths. But let me tell you why they were doing that. This was the only hot meal that lots of them had had in a long time and would have for quite a while. What's their story? And what are the impacts to their story? One of our family members helped one of them because we told them that they could take to-goes, but we hadn't taken any to-go boxes. But we came up with some pretty clever ideas on how they could take to-goes. And so one of our family members was helping one of them put together a to-go with masking tape. And so there was a plate like this, and then another plate was going to go on top with it. And so our family member was helping wrap masking tape around. And so the young person who was getting it said, "You've taped my hand to the plate." So that took a little rework to get that done. But I loved it because there was a tragic piece there with this person who was working so hard to get this to go, because this person wasn't taking it to go for them. They were taking it for their family that they had at home, because they knew there wasn't any food at the house. So, what are their stories? Because remember, the key to the story that David told us is, first, we have to be righteous. But second, we have to submit. Well, okay, as we get older, maybe we can do that. But when you're 15, 16, what do you think when someone comes to you and says, you got to submit? You're not going down that road. I'm not going to submit until you understand that submitting doesn't mean giving up. Submitting means starting this glorious walk. And can we be some influencers? Can we be facilitators to allow people to start the glorious walk? Think about Pilate. Who'd have ever thought his story would be one of an impact? Who'd have ever thought that one-on-one conversation he had actually moved him into the house of righteousness? Where are we? What's our story?